well, okay, but I think at this point I can hand over to Alex Todd, who's the DHS student officer, who is going to give us a kind of introduction to Bess.
Okay. So good evening, good afternoon. Thanks everybody for coming. As Kat said, my name is Alex Todd, and I'm here as the Design History Society's student officer to introduce this year's student-nominated keynote speaker, Dr. Bess Williamson. The student keynote is by now a pretty well-established tradition within the program of the DHS conference. And for me, as a representative of the conference and of the society's student base, it's a really important part. So the student keynote represents an opportunity for students to engage in the shaping of the conference's talking points and to assert what are, in their minds, the key questions and concerns of our discipline as it is today. And it is, in that sense, it's a kind of reflection upon the design historical field from the perspective of those who, perhaps already, but certainly in the coming years, will begin to shape the direction of all of its discourses. And as Kat was saying, the hosting of the student keynote online this year represents a wider effort on behalf of the conveners to reduce the carbon footprint of the conference. And it's also representative of another concern shared between the conveners, between the DHS and today's speaker, which is to make the student keynote as widely accessible and as inclusive as possible. And it's our shared hope in that regard that hosting today's keynote online, making it an inclusive space and a freely accessible space to students who aren't able to attend in person, that we might expand the reach of what I'm certain will be a fascinating and rewarding keynote, and further position design historical research as a welcoming space for all kinds of learners. So with that in mind, it's my incredibly great pleasure to formally introduce today's student keynote speaker, Dr. Bess Williamson, who is a historian of design and material culture with a particular interest in social and political concerns in design, including environmental, labor, justice, and rights issues, as they shape and are shaped by spaces and things. Her book, Accessible America, A History of Disability and Design, which was published in 2019, traces the history of design responses to disability rights from 1945 to recent times. This project shows how the concept of access emerged as a value in design in this period, with consequences for the everyday lives of disabled people, as well as for discourses around civil rights and design's role in society. Dr. Williams is also co-editor with Dr. Elizabeth Guffey of Making Disability Modern: Design Histories, a collection of case studies of objects, buildings, and systems that reflect changing design approaches to disability. And she's currently working on a new book project encompassing ideas of care and neurodiversity across fields of art, craft, and design. And Bess is Associate Professor of Design Studies at North Carolina State University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bess Williamson.
All right, so I'll go ahead then. Thank you. I'm so honored to have been invited as a keynote by the student committee of DHS. And while, of course, this virtual format is in part a nod to the necessity of limiting our conference air travel in a time of climate change, I also want to add that this remote presentation is an accessible format as well. So as I start my talk here on sensory design and disability, I'll spend some time sort of thinking aloud also about the space that we're in as a virtual and a hybrid space. So to start with, thinking about where we are. Over the last 4 years, we've all gathered as academics much more often online. Zoom is the most common platform for this, for me at least, but there are others too. And here I've put together some of the logos of some of these spaces that remind us that technology is not just a tool, it also creates the environment that we're in. And while all of these logos, and I'm sure there are others that I haven't included, in some ways they're all basically the same. Yet they also are different by various hints of design and social reception, right? Zoom's logo with a white camera on the blue ground, it so closely resembles the white cameras of FaceTime against green and Google Meet against sort of a blue-green, right? The outline S of Skype, the shadow T of Microsoft Teams, and maybe the most fun and youthful of all of these, Twitch, with its outlined digital eyes in a cartoon voice bubble. These are the same in some way, right? They all do the same thing, but they all have sort of slightly different meanings or applications as well, right? You'd likely be surprised if I were giving this talk on Twitch, as I have given one academic talk during the pandemic on Twitch. But certainly you'd be surprised if we were on FaceTime, right? Something that we more likely reserve for chatting with our friends. But where we are is not just the technical platform, it's the choices that we make in these spaces as well. So I'm going to perform an access check here, a part of disability culture that reminds us what we have in this space and makes some of these elements visible, right? First and foremost, this is a hybrid viewing space, right? We have some folks in Canterbury in the UK in a room together. Some people are in attending the conference, but perhaps watching from home or from their work if they couldn't be in Canterbury today, and others are across the world, I think especially in the US. So this creates some levels of access as well. We also have live captioning, what we call in the US CART, a professional who's off-site as well, who's typing my words for visual access. And if you prefer to follow along a text version of this talk, you can also do that at this link, tinyurl.com/DHS right? So this is our other ways that we can use this platform for access. And then finally, this is an open registration talk. So it also brings in members of the DHS broader network who might not be attending the conference, who couldn't travel, as well as others who are not part of this network, but maybe are likely to join us in the future. There are also, beyond the platform itself, there are also forms of access that we can make in any kind of space, right? You will hear me conduct some image description for non-sighted and less sighted attendees. Those of you who are on Zoom can also communicate through Zoom chat, although I'll tell you that I can't keep up with the chat while I'm speaking. It's also a way that you can communicate with each other or signal technical issues. And, I want to also recognize other access needs that might be provided, whether you're in the space of the conference or not, right? Can you sit in a comfortable place for this talk? Can you stand or lie down where you are? And I want to allow a minute here to allow any shifting around and moving that you might need to do to get into a good space, whether you're listening on Zoom or in the space of the conference. This is a moment where you might move seats to be where you're comfortable and have the best vantage point. So I'll give kind of a imagine hold music happening as you have a moment for that. These gestures toward access are part of a disability culture practice that makes access needs more visible, rather than the kind of hidden behind the scenes components that are often part of our spaces and gatherings. But I also want to explore a particular kind of object that might be part of our habits of listening, of being in academic spaces, which are fidget toys. This is a broad category of things that are made for occupying the body and the mind, whether during formal seated sessions like a classroom, or simply as a private activity in times of boredom, restlessness, or anxiety. On the screen, I have a range of commercially available fidgets, like a red fidget spinner, an orange magnetic toy that can be taken apart and reconfigured, a fidget cube that includes 6 different switches and dials for finger manipulation, and a series of plastic, metal, and glass beaded toys, all about hand size or sort of keychain size. These objects on the screen do not encompass all possible fidgets, right? We can also think of ways that people fidget using pens, hair ties, tapping their feet, cracking their knuckles, rocking, and more. But these give us a starting point for thinking about the design of sensory stimulation, which might be a part of our gatherings, whether virtual or physical, but that the virtual particularly provides for because we're in our own spaces, right? And our hands are usually not visible. To observe this small selection of objects, just to make some observations, right? They're at once entirely anodyne, banal, literally they're lightweight and ephemeral. They're fairly inexpensive. Most are made of synthetic materials in bright colors. There's a kind of lack of heft here that seems to be part of their fidgetiness. They're often a bit silly looking. They feel not serious. They're often associated with childhood as they're more available for children. So much so that some may remember in the early 2000s when fidget spinners were a craze that was deemed too distracting, and they were banned in many school classrooms. So they seem to exist on a kind of boundary, a border, if we use the theme of the conference, between assimilation to and disturbance of the required postures and behaviors of an academic gathering. They allow for those of us with restless bodies and hands to move around while also sitting still at the same time. But I would say they don't go unnoticed, particularly as we are calling attention to them, right? And remote access does seem to allow for greater possibilities for fidgeting, for body variability, for lying in bed, for walking while listening, and so on, than in-person conferencing does. So it's particularly appropriate for this talk. And I'll share here some of my own practice. I knit to keep my body and mind focused in the long seated hours of academic life. In recent years, especially in the many Zoom meetings and conferences that I've attended, my knitting output has significantly expanded. I've made winter hats and mittens, an improvised balaclava for the deepest parts of a Chicago winter. Now I'm trying at shorter sleeve things now that I've moved to a warmer part of the United States. And some in my household have received things like a skeleton hat. I had to include here a baby blanket that I made about 9 years ago for another thing that I made, this child, who's far outgrown it by now. But this really isn't about the output. I'll say I'm an okay knitter. Some of these things worked out well, some of them didn't. But as a process, I'm recognizing I'm recognizing knitting as a joyful and cozy task, but also a necessity. Without something to do with my hands, my mind, as I was diagnosed with ADHD several years ago, is unfocused and anxious. I tend to miss things that are conveyed in the long faculty meetings and engaging academic events that I go to. Academia, I'll be honest, is a hard place to focus your mind, right? Receiving that diagnosis helped me recognize how many of the struggles I have had to write, to focus, to organize in what is called executive function may be a product of my own body mind, particular to the expectations of university and academic life, which are great, but are often not very structured and not very explicit. So this talk is really not about my knitting, much as I'm happy to share it. Instead, I'm thinking about ways in which disability culture has picked up on the idea of a multisensory way of being as a form of access and as a form of being divergent. For example, echoing my own experience in a 2021 installation by the artist Jessica Watkin, which was part of an exhibition called Crypt Rituals at Tangled Arts in Toronto. The artist shared a basket of knitted pieces that she had made while listening to various works of literature. Watkins' vision began to degenerate when she was a teen. And by the time she was at university, she was not sure if she would be able to continue with her studies in English and theater, very reading intensive practices, as she was increasingly listening to things and having trouble focusing. She found knitting to help her listen to these works on audio. So her piece shows both some of the objects she knitted labeled with some of the literary works she read. So here we see an image of kind of a mottled blue and purple knitted piece with a label for Octavia Butler's novel Kindred. The piece also had a hanging knitted sculpture and a basket with a partially knitted piece and a note that included the words, "If you're standing, sitting, or close to knitting to listen, you may experience the need to touch it. Please do. This is a section of a piece that you can not only pick up and touch, but it is an unfinished art piece of knitting. If you know how to knit, offer a few rows. If you don't, let me give you a very brief introduction." And she goes on to instruct on making some basic stitches. Another piece in this same Crypt Rituals exhibition also engaged with touching and playing with the artwork. This was a piece by Logan Quinn, facilitated by his sister Hannah. Logan, a 25-year-old man who has Down syndrome, uses rows and sequences of small toy cars to play in his quiet time at home. As the artist statement read, this form of play has been given many labels over the years: adaptive behavior, compulsions, stimming, and sensory processing. Logan calls it play. The work sought to document this play with a video of Logan that's projected in the gallery, as well as a table with the cars that invited visitors to play along with the video. It's striking to me that these works take very individual activities of sensory making and play to share them through exhibition and video. This perhaps brings us back to think about Zoom as a space of access. As many disabled people pointed out in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, these were tools already familiar to many as access tools. In fact, remote work and school was something that many had requested and been denied, and now are again being denied as a form of access. And disability communities were quick to adopt these tools as a space of connection when many were sheltered during the pandemic, and many continue to be sheltered. On the screen is a screenshot from a remote access dance party, one of a series of events put on by the Critical Design Lab run by Amy Hamrai. Then the parties are hosted by Kevin Gotkin in his role as DJ Who Girl. The screen shows colorful squares in a Zoom block with people in costumes, with illustrated avatars and makeup, and many moving around in their screen space as DJ Who Girl, who's on the upper left in a pink wig and black and silver bustier, provided music and visual effects. Since these events, the Critical Design Lab has also launched a remote access archive documenting the ways that disabled communities have used remote forms of work and organizing over time. They trace these practices of Zoom gathering back to the letters, newsletters, online message boards, and texting that all provided forms of access in disability communities that were geographically separated and also separated by barriers in public space. Likewise, the specialized skill work like sign language interpretation, as well as live captioning, such as the specialist from Interpreting Matters who is captioning this talk, have often been done remotely and off-site. So the experience of reading or seeing content provided by someone who's not in the same space was already more familiar to deaf people before the age of Zoom conferences. To return to our own space, which is admittedly a lot less animated than this screenshot, in most standard academic spaces, remote presentations are an exception to the standard design of the conference, right? Therefore, whether defined as an accessible event, a climate conscious event, an event like DHS's keynote last year, which was remote because of the speaker's visa issues, these remote formats are defined as external to the intended design of a conference and therefore have some kind of connection to disability inherently. Disability itself is often defined as a divergence from a perceived norm, a misfit. As the disability studies theorist Rosemary Garland Thompson puts it, misfit is a useful term to consider disability in a larger social context as, quote, an incongruent relationship between two things, a square peg in a round hole. The problem with a misfit then inheres not only in either of the two things, but rather in their juxtaposition, the awkward attempt to fit them together, right? To fit together our varied selves with the various standard environments offered to us by school, by work, and so on. This notion of misfit is of particular interest to us as design scholars, as it suggests the ways that design and disability mutually make each other, right, as they meet intended design with the specifics of people's bodies and minds. This opening foray into thinking about remote access and the varied movements and activities that might accompany it serves as my entry point into discussing sensory access as a category. And when I'm talking about this, some of these examples may be familiar to you, some may not, right? They're varied efforts to address the sensory sensitivity of neurodivergent people or people with a range of mental and cognitive disabilities. So we have a lot of like variednesses that are coming together in this category. In addition to the things I've mentioned, fidgets, knitting, playing with cars, and Zoom dancing, I'll add a couple of other possible design instances of sensory access. So these might be discrete specific objects like fidget toys. They might be more about a particular design approach within an existing space, such as sensory-friendly time periods at a popular children's event space like Chuck E. Cheese. I don't know if Chuck E. Cheese exists outside the US, but I'm sure something like it exists elsewhere, but where lights are lowered and automatic sounds of game machines are muted for certain time periods. Likewise, a sensory map of a museum might show something like low lighting and less crowded areas of an existing space. There are also a few rare sort of higher design type of projects, such as the squeeze chair, a collaboration between MIT designer Wendy Jacobs and Temple Grandin, who's one of the most visible figures representing autism in the contemporary US. Grandin's own life story includes using a squeezing mechanism that was designed to calm cows down on her family's farm. She discovered that its pressing sensation was also calming to her. So she worked with Jacobs to develop an enveloping chair that could squeeze with the use of a foot pedal. This is, I'll just be honest, this is fairly new work for me. I'm still figuring it out. But these are some of the pathways into this category of sensory access that I've been thinking about, right? This is a material expression of the concept of neurodiversity or neurodivergence. These are terms coined by autistic people: neurodiversity by Judy Singer, neurodivergent by Cassian Asumasu, both in the 1990s, challenging some of the terms that had been placed on them, right? The difference between certain diagnostic categories and terms and these broader categories. Neurodiversity can be associated with a range of possible ways of having a mind. Autism, ADHD, dyslexia, other learning disabilities, as well as conditions like brain fog due to medication, trauma's effect on cognition, or different ways of thinking or spatial navigation that might come out of signing communities or blind experiences. These works suggest the possible analysis as forms of cryptechnoscience, a term coined by Amy Hamrai and Kelly Fritsch, to the ways that the design, apologies, sorry, just lost my place for a second, but referring to the ways that disabled people use their own life knowledge to navigate the technical world, often becoming creators and inventors of their own technologies or their own uses of standard spaces and things. Or Hamrai's larger framework of critical access studies, which points us to the ways that the design of access itself is constructed and usually reflects social norms and ideas about disability. Sensory access also brings further attention to the role of care in disabled communities. And I'll say this is an area that I think has particularly has been neglected in access studies of design, including in my own work. that looks, care work can be read in a few different ways. For example, Leah Lakshmi Pipsana Samarasinha offers a liberatory idea of care work, where disabled people and their loved ones often find ways to navigate entrenched ableism and barriers to life through things like mutual aid or just simply sharing strategies for navigating bureaucracy. However, it's notable that sensory access doesn't always come out of design processes of agency and community, but is also institutionally designed and thus can also raise issues of care as a form of coercion and control. Akemi Nishida asked us to examine the, quote, messy entanglements of care as it's provided by medical institutions or even among families and social networks. In her recent book, Just Care, Nishida notes that, quote, care often emerges from needs, while needs are not always met with care. And care can be, quote, a mechanism of social oppression and control, while simultaneously being a tool with which marginalized communities activate, engage in, and sustain social justice fights. This critical view of care, again, I see as significant to design scholarship. We too, as design historians, are often aware of the gap between intention and outcome, right? The possibility of function as opposed to the reality of things not working. To go a bit to some historical examples or some outside examples. One particular point in the history of sensory design comes out of a messy, power-laden environment of state-run institutional care for intellectually disabled children. This was the work of Elaine Ostroff, a theater educator who recognized the possibilities of movement as well as the physical materials of sets and props as useful when she was working with groups of disabled children who visited the theater where she was working in Boston in the 1960s. She received a graduate degree in education and began working in mental health services in her home state of Massachusetts in the US in the 1970s. And her book, Humanizing Environments, documents small design interventions in institutional care settings where a team of art, design, and education workers conducted interventions to provide mobility and sensory access in very restrictive institutional settings. Simple material approaches included soft surfaces, stimulating textures like dried corn, and access to personally comforting objects. The image on the cover of her book focuses in a little fisheye circle into a particular joyful relationship of care. Mother, child, or female caregiver and child who are laughing together inside of a small tub that has in it some kind of sensory filler, possibly dried corn or cut up foam. The child's shirt is pulled up as he's been rolling in this tactile material. And as I show a few images from this book, I want to provide a bit of a content warning that these include photographs of unidentified children with their eyes blocked out in institutional settings that were likely constraining to them. Images of older teens sitting on hard tables in otherwise empty tiled rooms show some of the broader context of these institutions, whose design reflected the priorities of normative, often punitive behavioral training, right? Where things like running, playing, any kind of destruction of materials was banned. And the image that we see here is one of a fairly empty room with minimal furniture. By contrast, Ostroff and her collaborators explicitly define the difference between the needs of these children, who they call patients, as opposed to the institution's wants for order, cleanliness, and discipline. They introduce large padded objects and mats, spaces of play in contrast to the spaces of order that was otherwise there. In this sense, we might see them as a form of cryptechnoscience, right? The DIY care work, pushing back against restrictive institutional rules. However, they're also very revealing of the constraints of these projects, described as often on a budget and produced in limited timeframes, which were, in that sense, they were sort of designed to accommodate the institutions that they were working for. These tools were designed what was seen as inevitable destruction by kids, that they would make a mess or break furniture. And so instead of reinforcing that kind of defensive design, Ostrow's team focused on objects and surfaces that could be manipulated and touched. She described it as building arrangements that would allow them to, quote, have an effect on the world and affirm their existence. That meant padded shapes, rolling tubes, ramps, slides, and swings. Where there were simple sets of steps for physical therapy, designers added a loft with a full staircase. They added beanbag chairs, pillows in puzzle shapes, and inflated inner tubes intended to be played with, lain on and under, thrown, and rolled. One recurring design motif is this space of a small tub or shallow basin where tactile materials could be collected. This was a feature that was designed to easily fit within existing spaces using a fairly affordable items like a kid's swimming pool. This miniature world of free movement and manipulation also, would fit the criteria of institutional management, giving a contained space where potentially only 1 or 2 people might be able to fit. Today, many of the methods used in these interventions are familiar, especially to anyone who spends time in elementary school and primary schools, right? Where spaces are increasingly built for movement, where sensory toys and equipment have become mainstream. I'll cite as just one example, the pilot episode of the public school sitcom Abbott Elementary, which focuses on the need for a carpet for kindergartners to sit on, right? The idea of soft spaces, of movement, has greatly influenced the design of primary education overall in the last 50 years. But to return to our fidget toys from this particular example is to shift and scales entirely, right? Away from the institutional setting and into a much more gray area in a contemporary sense, where disability things merge into the overall material landscape of other stuff, especially stuff associated with childhood. These fidget toys are also quite varying in terms of how much they're associated with disability, right? They include a range of objects, beaded lanyards, key rings, plastic and metal beads, rubber beaded necklaces that are made of a hard silicone so they can be chewed. They're called jewelry. All of these items could easily be cast or understood simply as, childhood playthings or novelties. In this case, they are explicitly labeled as, quote, fidgets made by a neurodivergent for neurodivergence by their maker, Alyssa Merklinger, who has an online shop called the All Things Sensory Shop. So they present, in this case, at least, a clear sense of group identification, right? But within that identification as fidgets made for neurodivergence, they have a really wide range of preferences from the actual texture, but also sort of towards expression, right? Some use brighter colors, some have more of a muted appearance, and so on. Merkinger's fidgets offer a strong sort of for us, by us type of message in marketing, but fidget toys can also be much more commercial and vague in presentation, right? The examples on the left, a fidget spinner, this magnetic toy, and the fidget cube are, have a various other design associations as well. Perhaps sort of the idea of like a mathematics toy or something that is more acceptable or understandable in an office type of environment. I'll say for myself, these objects are very striking to me as a sort of middle-aged person because this category of object did not have a name when I was a child, right? My own child, by contrast, as a product of US public elementary school, immediately identifies them as fidgets and names them as a noun referring to fidgets. Nonetheless, while they have a kind of newness to them, they also have a more long-standing familiarity, right? The literature on fidgeting points to 2 potentially conflicting narratives. One, that fidgeting is inherently human and timeless, with manipulable hand and mouth objects that are found across time and space, right? So ranging from Chinese baoding balls, rosary beads, fans, or cigarettes. But at the same time, fidgeting, and sort of by contrast, fidgeting is noted as more specific, right? As more neurodiversity connected, as fidgeting can be stimming, a stigmatized form of bodily movement that's comfortable and soothing to neurodiverse people, including autistic people, and people like me with ADHD or anxiety. Fidgets have the potential to be read as productive or unproductive. Are they a form of creative expression and engagement in themselves, or do they facilitate engagement by creating more docile subjects in institutional settings? In other words, might I have invited you to fidget during this talk in order to make you listen to me better, right? Or am I sort of providing that openness to your own expression? If the material variation of these objects tells us a lot about their own contradictions, so does their popular news coverage. News stories over the last decade have described the origins of fidgets in a few different ways. Some trace the fidget spinner, for example, to a 1997 patent by Catherine Hedinger. According to this version of the story, fidget spinners actually have their own disability history. Catherine was a parent with chronic pain and developed a plastic spinning disc that could be twirled on a finger as a way to occupy her child when she could not. Her patent pinpoints a possible invention story for fidget spinners, and one with kind of a sad ending. She wasn't able, her patent expired just at the time when fidget spinners began to be produced by the millions, so she never cashed in. At the same time, other observers contest this story. They point out that her original spinner doesn't have a ball bearing or spindle construction. So as soon as there were stories crediting her, there were others debunking it, reporting this as an origin story that had spun out of control. So there's this sense of also kind of contested origins to these objects. Meanwhile, other fidget toys like the fidget cube provided more successful storylines and more associated with kind of traditional inventor narratives, particularly around men as inventors. The fidget cube made records in 2016 as it raised $6 million on Kickstarter, many times over the original fundraising goal. Its founders, brothers Mark and Matthew McLaughlin, present themselves as scientists on their website in white coats. They market themselves both through an anxiety-adjacent brand name, Antsy Labs, and an aspirational inventor story. Here they pose with the question, what's it like inventing a product and getting it made, which they see as a question that everyone has for them. Fidgets are a reminder of how neurodiversity is inherently embedded in social context. What is attractive, what is acceptable, what is likely to be recommended or banned are all variations that depend on who is using it and where. If you have a fidget in front of you, I invite you to think about the many potential readings of this object. What is the sensory experience of it? How do texture, color, and sound and smell fit into your own cognitive experience? Which is to say, does having it help you think and learn? Does it remind you of other object sensations that might be more positive? And thinking of the dimensions of interdependence and care, how did you acquire it? Was it your own purchase from your own desire? Does it express your identity like a fashion accessory might? Or is it a prescriptive object presented by an educator or medical therapist to produce a certain outcome of soothing or behavioral change? Whether or not these objects are clearly associated with disability is also tied to various metrics of identity and institutional recognition. The scholar Lindsay Eales writes about makeup and prescription medication as two tools of accommodation that enable her to study and work, to be not read as, quote, crazy or lazy. If anything, she writes with her collaborator, Danielle Pierce, quote, they are designed to render Lindsay unreadable as disabled, unquote. This category of disability things that are unmarked as such, that might be considered disability things only in relation to who uses them, have embodied potential not only to unlock or restrain one's mind, but to identify, to make a person either readable or unreadable as disabled. Fidget toys offer a very visible and in many cases destigmatized version of sensory design, right? No one had to intervene into like an institutional setting to allow these to exist. Usually they go either invited or allowed. But as Garland Thompson's idea of the misfit work, they also show disability to be a product of both a person's distinct body mind and the world that it's in, where the idea of what is normal is constructed by design and social expectations. Their portability means that they appeared in varied contexts, and like the humanizing environments that Ostroff designed, they bring about access by carving out individual bubbles of material difference, giving the possibility of agency in any space. So for one last example, in thinking this category through, I want to go to another institutional context, although not one of care work as we might conventionally define it, but one that's probably familiar to many in the design studies community of the museum. This is a space I am familiar with, the Art Institute of Chicago, which until recently was where I worked. It was a partner museum to the school where I worked. The Art Institute is a major museum consisting of a building that was built in 1893 with several additions, including a modern wing designed by Renzo Piano in 2009, nearly 20 years after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires access in public space. The building consists of spaces that are designed with no awareness at all of disability access, like the stepped front, as well as those that show the effect of legal requirements, such as the modern wing entrance that has an entry at ground level or close to ground level. But one thing to note is aspects of sensory access are not designed into the building. We're not historically a part of the design plan either in 1893 or 2009, nor are they legally required in a contemporary sense. Only recently has the museum begun to address areas of access that are not related to architectural regulation. The museum breaks down its access information for visitors with mobility needs, those who are deaf and have hearing loss, those who are blind and have low vision, and those with autism or sensory processing disorders, right? So we can think for the starting point about how access is kind of placed in these varying categories of distinction for visitors to navigate and find out about themselves. In this last category, which is kind of the newest arrival into the Art Institute's access information, there is a sensory map that highlights areas of the museum that have less overwhelming noise and crowds. Areas are color-coded as more likely to be either crowded or brightly lit, or quiet and less crowded for each map. So for example, on the map that identifies areas that are more likely to be crowded and busy, they're in red, and then those less likely are in green. The red areas mark the entrance halls, which are likely to be crowded and noisy as sound bounces off the stone walls and marble floors. Interestingly, for my fellow design historians and museum studies folks, the sensory map is also a map toward non-Western art and the so-called applied arts. So our design collections. The arts of India, Asia, Native American art, and African art, and textiles are among the least crowded spaces. So these are the spaces that are marked on this sensory map. A second part of the sensory map is about lighting, showing areas with natural light or low light. Again, the brightest light marked in yellow is in entrance halls and bright atriums that are often at the intersection between departments. And again, the purple marked areas of lower light are also in non-Western departments and applied arts departments, right? Asian art, Native American, and African art sections contain both more atmospheric installations, such as a very dark temple-like room that was designed by Tadao Ando for the Chinese scrolls in the department, as well as lower lit spaces for textile works and paper drawings. So I read these sensory design maps as an illustration of how this more recent access concern is layered on top of already existing pathways that are created by all kinds of public access concerns, whether we can think of elevators, wheelchair access, or even issues around, finding the toilet and information desk. However, because the measures of low lighting and quieter spaces often don't correspond to areas of public access and navigation, they're often in conflict with wheelchair access. So we can imagine them causing access conflicts for multiply disabled visitors. Sensory forms of access are often unreliable and unlabeled. We can imagine how these maps go out of date with changes of exhibitions and the popularity of different spaces at different times. Creating sensory environments in major museums, in fact, requires more than an access map layered on existing space. Instead, it would require sort of ongoing maintenance, updates, and communication. We could imagine, for example, the possibility of marking spaces within the gallery to ask for participation from other visitors to guarantee certain crowd levels or increase awareness among the guides and guards of where those lighted areas are. Instead, this map names a possibility that is unlikely to be actually guaranteed. So for the very last few comments here, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and speak to you directly. Hello again. To conclude, these examples of sensory design, as disparate as they are in time and in kind, bring together design, care work, and the complex politics of disability. Sensory design norms are in flux and changing, not, to be honest, not unlike physical accessibility, which can also be confusing and unreliable. However, the sensory is an especially challenging experience to name and to design for. The ephemeral nature of sound, light, and subjective phenomenological responses to them makes it so that our vocabulary is sometimes limited to distinguish between different space, hence terms like sensory friendly, which might be interpreted in a few different ways. One of the best ways to define sensory access is the ways in which it identifies a norm by diverging from it, right? Having a quiet room or low light space helps us identify the unmarked space as loud and bright. Having a fidget toy helps us identify a gathering as perhaps otherwise non-tactile, movement restricted, or requiring stillness in a way that is less likely to be announced as part of that event. In this idea that sensory access might bring out qualities of normative design, I also think to the architect and historian David Gisson's work. Gisson writes about an architecture of disability that might go beyond the goals of access, sort of functional access, that would seek to recast architectural aesthetics themselves in recognition of the reality of varied bodies and minds. Gisson calls for the, quote, preservation of disability, recognizing that designers have often sought to eliminate vulnerability and vulnerable populations, particularly in the functional smoothness of modernism. Instead, he suggests seeking out incapacity in design, appreciating difference of experience, for example, between walking and resting as equally important vantage points on a pathway up a hill. In this case, he's discussing the steep walkway up to the Acropolis in Athens. To return to our own format of a remotely accessible talk, this format allows a somewhat lighter climate footprint. It also allows various coexisting forms of communication access, and in ways both designed and not, it has created a sensory experience. I'm not seeking to exalt Zoom as some wondrous space for all bodies and minds, but instead to call attention to the ways that it allows for greater variation of sensory experience. It connects our very different spaces with their qualities of light, smells, textures, and tastes. The greatest possibility of sensory access is recognizing that such a variability is a given, rather than a problem to be solved. We're not seeking one singular conference experience. Ideally, we might make time and space for this variability and offering multiple options: to zoom in, to be together, to sit still, to move around, to stim, and to fidget. Thank you. So these are my initial thoughts on this. I'd be pleased to hear or read your questions and comments. If any of you have fidgets that you'd like to share, that's open as well. But I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bess. You got a round of applause. I don't know if you heard that, but
Great.
we're going to move over to questions now, and we're going to do it in a couple of different ways. I've asked Alex if he could respond with the first question, and then Jessica is going to be helping with mics in the room, as I will be as well, and Kim is also going to be building those online. So, so Alex, if I can hand over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Beth. That was such an engaging and exciting talk. And you spoke at the end about some of the challenges of designing and labeling within this area. And I wondered, a bit of a broad question, but I wondered if you've encountered particular challenges in the building out of your histories of disability design that perhaps you haven't found in other areas of your design historical research.
Yeah, thank you. So question about sort of some of these challenges around sort of labeling and calling attention to, or the conflicts in sensory access. You know, so to what extent they're kind of different to or similar to other studies that I've done in physical and sort of mobility access. I mean, I think this really points to some of the challenges in the history of making access in general, that it was historically often led by wheelchair users. And the ramp, while an incredibly like powerful and useful tool, also, you know, can appear to be an overly like easy technological fix, right? Where we can look at a building, it either has a ramp or it doesn't. Now, of course, there are many other questions like, is it blocked? Is the door open? You know, where does it lead to? All kinds of things. So in fact, it's not as simple as it might appear anyway, but there is a way in which a single physical kind of fix has dominated our discourses around how design works. And of course, there are many areas where that doesn't really work, right? Sign language interpreting can't just be a switch that turns on, you know, this sort of thing. But so I think in some ways, I would say it sort of calls attention to the ongoing life cycles of access, the ways in which sort of ongoing maintenance and attention are necessary. And when it's sort of made explicit, you know, as opposed to, but I would say, you know, there are sometimes the goals of kind of seamlessly adding access that I think are much more challenging in when it's recognized that people's access needs might simply conflict in the same space. So I hope that answers. Thank you for that great question.
Thank you, Bess. Kim, could I ask you if there's any questions on the chat? Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, sometimes I have applause, I would say. Someone made a comment, and maybe it makes sense to you, but I'll just read it out. There's one thing that also comes to mind about the AICT is that one of its most sensory-friendly hours is when its use pack is available to only members. So I guess there's a question about access there, that yes, one can access, but one has to be a member of these institutions. I don't know, class issue. So I read out another question we're asking Virginia. She said, I was a recent graduate from UCA. I want to say thank you for making the book, Making Disability Modern. It's hugely influenced and inspired my thesis in my current design project, where I looked at connections and influences of disability designing and progression of taking thought. But yeah, I guess if you can maybe perhaps make a comment about the question of membership. I suppose.
Yeah, and I can explain. First of all, I'm delighted to see my former student, Denny Mora, who commented on here, who's in Chicago still as a curator, who's observing that at the Art Institute, where, as I described, that one of the quieter, you know, one of the sensory friendly hours, I mean, is the members hour. So
Well, that was dramatic. Maybe while we're waiting, if anybody has any questions in the room. Yeah, Olivia, you will have the honor of doing so. I think maybe I'll take this moment just to talk about where we're going next while we wait for Bess to join us back in the room. So we're going to be finishing here in about 10 minutes would be the plan, perhaps sooner. And we're going to be heading to the gala dinner, if you've booked a place at that, which is going to be at Westgate Hall, which I can also get up a map for shortly. And perhaps I'll also say what's happening tomorrow morning, which is at 9:30 in here. We have the Design History Society AGM. Bess is here. Okay. Kim, I think you just need to unmute. Thank you.
Hi, sorry. Well, also to say, Kat, if you want to continue your announcement.
No, not really.
Okay. You'll all make, I can feel confident that you'll make it to your dinners. But anyway, I think we're just thinking of, from a museum standpoint, you know, the ways in which a I don't know how much I got caught off there, but you know, the museum at the Art Institute opens first for members only. And even the question of like museums that are publicly open all the time, as opposed to, you know, requiring membership or admission, of course, is an access question in itself. But you know, that this itself is a form of limitation. You know, I think we also may think about, from my perspective, I also think about ways in which within communities where sensory sensitivity is a concern, right? Among families, you know, among folks who are seeking a quieter experience, there may already be sort of networks of knowledge around like when a place is open. I always think of this, like my number one travel tip to all people is to go to the evening hours of most museums are usually just like less crowded, right? That's the only way, in my opinion, to see the Louvre in Paris is to go to their evening hours, right? And this is in no way is this labeled as like a sensory friendly moment, right? But there may be forms of knowledge and you know, and so in some ways I might also consider, you know, ways that are beyond the museum's programming, that spaces become, you know, sort of sensory spaces or accessible spaces unbeknownst to or without the intention of the institution itself, as well.
Thank you, Bess. And I think
I'm not sure I quite heard the second, but I heard a call out to my book with Elizabeth Guthrie, and I'm delighted to hear whatever positive comment it was. So thank you all.
Thank you. I think Livia had a question.
Hi, Bess, can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know if you can see me.
No.
I think so, right?
I can't see you, but I can hear you.
It's Lydia Resende. We met a while ago. Nice to see you again. Thank you so much for the lecture. Very inspiring, and it has raised so many questions about our responsibilities as educators, and also in the spirit of this being a student-led keynote, I'd like to ask how your propositions in sensory design, stability, and care translate into teaching and learning design and design history. And I ask that in the context of our classrooms and course designs and all the kind of equipment, technology of education is more often than not predicated on the immobilization of the body, on, you know, expected behaviors in the classroom, and also expected behaviors, especially in design history or the kind of so-called contextual studies disciplines in which discussion and thinking on your feet and being able to discuss and being able to raise your voice and talk about your ideas is the norm, has been the norm. And I'd like to see how you have been responding to issues of care, accessibility, while teaching design history in the classroom. And obviously, what are your new ways in which you have been approaching? And any other possibly limiting classroom expectations. We know how limiting they are and they can be. So what has been your approach?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question, which about, you know, how these issues come up. They're so prevalent in our classrooms, right? We may be often teaching in these cramped spaces that will require very specific forms of seating, fluorescent lights, which are many of us are very sensitive to, a lack of airflow, you know, all of these kinds of things, not to mention just the standard expectations, right? That of people sitting still, not being distracted, and so on. And, you know, I'll mainly say this is a sort of work that comes out of my own observation, particularly between remote teaching and in-person teaching, noting that, of course, just to say, remote teaching was very difficult for me, right? This was a very challenging time for so many of us to quickly learn tools and the time and balancing our households and so on. But I also recognize so many advantages to remote teaching, including from a design history perspective, right? That we could do like observations in our own space, right? I often do an access exercise where students trace the entrance to the school building and through and up, you know, into the classroom. But looking at that institutional space like can be sort of limited, not to mention every student is looking at the exact same space, right? So it's not that interesting. Instead, I would have students trace the entryway to their building. I think it's usually not too like personal or revealing of their personal space, you know, but to just talk about the entrance spaces. And that kind of opened up to me the possibility of like using our spaces in certain ways, using that variation. And another thing that I'm quite interested is thinking about how this actually connects to histories of teaching about design, right? Which have historically used various forms of sensory observation, and as well as making and remaking things, in various material culture traditions of like, making the object that you're studying or being in the space, and to think of ways that we can use sensory observations, to recognizing that, the varied learning sort of skills and sharpness that students may have, that they may be more engaged with thinking about things in that way. So some of us may already have some of these exercises in our classrooms that we're using, and they could be recast as like a form of access. But I would also say these are all, within the context of our institutions, right? To the extent to which they allow for greater variation, right? We are not usually trained in making access in the classroom. So all of this, I don't know, I always hope to think that this doesn't like add a lot more burden to the individual instructor, but instead sort of allows for us to question aspects of the classroom that are already not working for us. So that's sort of my thoughts on that. But I think there's a lot around teaching that could come up here, and the kinds of knowledge that we're producing in different environments. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Which is that it strikes me that as someone who hasn't kind of done work in your area before, Bess, but I have been interested in the kind of rise of the writing of sensorial design history more generally. So one of the first papers we had was thinking about smell here, but also there's interest in sound, atmosphere, or kind of sensational history of objects and spaces. And I wonder, is that something that you've observed? Is there something going on there, do you think? And is there something that maybe those maybe at the moment separate areas of activity can offer each other in some way?
I mean, just to say yes, and this is like so much of what I've learned from being in disability studies, right? Is sort of like just a recognition, this is the water that we all are swimming in, of, preference to certain kinds of knowledge, right? We as design historians, most of us trained in some kind of visual medium, right, are living in a world that privileges the visual as a form of information. And here I'm entirely cribbing on the work of Georgina Klieg, who's written a number of fabulous books, but including one called More Than Meets the Eye, What Blindness Brings to Art, where she simply describes the overemphasis on the visual in the way we talk, in information, the way we talk about artwork, and asks us to think about other ways of thinking about work, particularly through touch. So like Georgina, as a blind person, has access to touch tours in museums that many of us don't. And so she often gives guided tours where she narrates the touch of like a Matisse, sculptural bronze at the Museum of Modern Art to an audience. So suddenly she's the privileged expert, as opposed to the audience. And there's so many dimensions of this that I think open up, particularly the tactile, right? We've all known that like chairs sitting on a platform are not the best ways for us to interact with them, but we usually have to, museums and preservation and so on. But the question of when, can we expand our sense of knowledge to these other senses? How might we gain access to that? I think is one of like intellectual inclusiveness, as well as sort of the practical question of like who is included in a conversation, that those things come together. I'd love to address Jane's comment in the chat. If it's all right, I'll just read it out loud because I think it's great. Please. We are talking simultaneously about kind of the intellectual and historical and the everyday experience of our own community in a conference, right? Jane writes, as a design historian with ME with multiple physical and cognitive disabilities, I've spent many conferences, including DHS conferences, lying under benches in corridors, under tables in empty rooms, in cloakrooms, back to my hotel room in order to escape the sensory overload and people, and also once it becomes impossible to sit up anymore. As you suggest, there's no one single conference experience. Zoom has enabled us to take part in conferences both as speaker and participant. Hopefully more conferences will have quiet spaces in the future and more conferences will have remote access for those who are housebound, but want to stay current in terms of design history debates, right? So, you know, just to note that this is very much a present issue that often isolates individual people who simply feel, you know, and I would say, expands to say, I think we've probably all had the experience of being at a conference and just being like, I can't, you know, it's the travel, the exhaustion, our own personal body minds of overwhelm, you know, at the same time as it also brings the tremendous joy of like hearing about people's research. But you know, I just like, I have to believe that we will not leave behind entirely the remote experiences that we've had in conferences in particular, right? We know that like everyone traveling to the same place is just not possible. And everyone being in that same place for these long days is not always possible. And so, you know, when are we able to continue to explore these tools? Because they do make our conferences more accessible. They really, you know, they really bring connections that we, in many cases, cannot make otherwise. So I appreciate, Jane, you sharing your experience with that.
Thank you. Well, I think the note of bringing in one of our guests' voice into the session, but also ending on the note around accessibility and inclusivity and thinking about future conferences seems like an appropriate note to end tonight's keynote. So